Security. Isabella Harrington's voice cut through the classical quartet's melody like a knife through silk. Remove this woman immediately. Racheal Westbrook didn't flinch. She stood at the entrance of the Grand Estate's reception hall, her worn leather briefcase contrasting sharply with the opulence surrounding her. $10,000 gowns, imported orchids cascading from gold fixtures, and a 6-tier wedding cake that probably cost more than most people's cars. Racheal took 3 measured steps forward, her sensible heels clicking against the floor with the steady rhythm of inevitability. 20 years. 20 years of planning, of building her career, of gathering irrefutable evidence. 20 years of waiting for this exact moment. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Racheal said, her voice calm but carrying across the stunned silence that had fallen over the 300 wedding guests. She set her briefcase on the nearest table, right next to a centerpiece of white roses that cost more than a month's rent for most Americans. 2 security guards in ill-fitting tuxedos moved toward her, but something in her posture, the way she stood with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged, made them hesitate. Isabella swept across the room, her champagne-colored designer gown trailing behind her like the train of entitled presumption. At 62, she had maintained her looks through what Racheal suspected was a combination of excellent genetics and expensive procedures. Her blonde hair was styled in an elaborate updo, and diamonds dripped from her ears, neck, and wrists. Probably $250,000 worth, casually displayed. "I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing," Isabella hissed, her perfectly painted lips barely moving. "But you have exactly 30 seconds to leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." Racheal opened her briefcase with deliberate slowness, the click of the latches echoing in the silent ballroom. "Trespassing?" She pulled out a folder, its contents representing 2 decades of meticulous documentation. "That's interesting, Mrs. Harrington. You can't trespass on your own property." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Women in couture gowns leaned toward their tuxedoed companions, whispering behind manicured hands. The bride, a young woman who looked barely 25 in her elaborate white gown, stood frozen near the cake, her face pale. "Your own property?" Isabella laughed, but the sound was brittle. "This estate has been in my family for generations. You're clearly delusional, and I'm calling the police right now." "Please do," Racheal said, meeting her gaze steadily. "In fact, I insist on it. Detective Eric Shaw from the Saratoga Springs Police Department should be particularly interested in what I have to say." Isabella's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, but she recovered quickly, her expression hardening into the imperious mask she'd worn for decades. "You're making a terrible mistake. Do you have any idea who I am? Who these people are?" She gestured to the crowd of New York's elite. "One call from me, and you'll never work in this state again." Racheal allowed herself a small smile. "Mrs. Harrington, I stopped working 3 years ago. I'm retired. So your threats are, unfortunately for you, completely meaningless." "Then what do you want?" Isabella's voice rose, losing some of its controlled composure. "Money? Is this some kind of extortion scheme? Because I can tell you right now, what I want," Racheal interrupted, her voice cutting through Isabella's escalating panic, "is what belongs to me. What has always belonged to me. This estate, every brick, every window, every square foot of the 147 acres it sits on." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Someone near the back said, "This is better than the wedding." Isabella's face flushed red beneath her expertly applied makeup. "James, Thomas." She snapped her fingers at the security guards. "I don't care what this lunatic is saying. Remove her, now." The guards moved forward again, but before they could reach Racheal, the ballroom's main doors swung open. Detective Eric Shaw walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was in his late 50s, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen everything human nature had to offer. The good, the bad, and the unconscionable. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the opulent wedding, the nervous guests, Isabella's fury, and finally, Racheal. His expression changed immediately, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like relief. "Racheal Westbrook," he said, and there was warmth in his voice. "I'll be damned." Isabella pounced on his arrival. "Detective Shaw, thank God you're here. This woman has crashed my daughter's wedding. She's making insane claims about owning my property, and she's refusing to leave. I want her arrested immediately for trespassing, for disturbing the peace, for—" "Mrs. Harrington," Shaw interrupted, raising one hand. "I need you to take a breath and step back." "Excuse me?" Isabella's voice dripped with indignation. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea how much my family donates to the Police Benevolent Fund every year?" Shaw's expression didn't change. "I know exactly who you are, Mrs. Harrington. I also know who she is." He nodded toward Racheal. "And if Racheal Westbrook says she owns this property, then I'm willing to bet my pension that she does." The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Isabella looked like she'd been slapped. "That's ridiculous. This estate has been in my family since 2003. Racheal interjected calmly. "The year you and your late husband, Richard Harrington, used forged documents and bribed county officials to illegally occupy the property that I inherited from my grandmother, Margaret Westbrook." "That's a lie." Isabella's composure finally shattered completely. Her voice rose to a near shriek. "My husband was a respected businessman. How dare you accuse him of fraud?" Racheal pulled a document from her folder and held it up. "This is the original deed to this property, signed by my grandmother and transferred to me upon her death in December 2002. It was recorded with the county clerk's office on January 15th, 2003. She pulled out another document. "This is the tax record showing that I have paid property taxes on this estate for the past 20 years. Another document. This is the survey of the property boundaries, conducted in 2003, clearly identifying me as the legal owner." Shaw stepped forward, and Racheal handed him the documents. He examined them carefully, his trained eyes scanning the details. After a long moment, he looked up at Isabella. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm going to need you to produce your ownership documents." "I don't have to produce anything," Isabella snapped. "This is my home. Get out, all of you." "Actually," Shaw said, his voice taking on an official tone, "you do. Because what Ms. Westbrook is alleging constitutes fraud and potentially multiple felonies. So I strongly suggest you cooperate." A man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd. He was in his 30s, with the soft features of someone who'd never known real hardship. "Mother, what's going on? Who is this woman?" "Jessie," Isabella said, her voice strained. "Go back to your wife. This is nothing. Just some confused woman who—" "I'm not confused, Mr. Harrington," Racheal said, looking at Jessie. "And I think you know that. I think you've always known that something wasn't right about how your family came to possess this property." Jessie's face went pale. He glanced at his mother, then back at Racheal. I don't understand what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Racheal's voice was gentle now, almost sympathetic. 20 years ago, you were 17. You were arrested for possession with intent to distribute. You were facing 10 years in a juvenile facility. And then, suddenly, the charges disappeared. Your record was sealed, expunged, like it never happened. The color drained from Isabella's face. How do you know about that? Racheal turned her full attention to Jesse. Do you remember the judge who presided over your case? The one who gave you a second chance, who believed you when you said you were holding those drugs for someone else, who saw potential in you when everyone else saw a spoiled rich kid heading for prison. Jesse stared at her, his eyes widening. Judge Westbrook, he whispered. You're Judge Westbrook. The ballroom exploded with noise. Guests pushed forward, trying to get a better view. The bride started crying. Someone's grandmother actually applauded. Shaw's expression changed to one of deep respect. You're the Judge Westbrook? The one who served on the federal bench for 15 years? Racheal nodded. I retired 3 years ago. I've spent that time gathering evidence, building my case, waiting for the right moment. She looked directly at Isabella. Today is that moment. Isabella seemed to shrink, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. You can't prove anything. Even if those documents are real, we've lived here for 20 years. We've maintained this property, improved it, invested millions into it. There are laws about adverse possession, Adverse possession requires, among other things, that the possession be open and notorious, Racheal said. But you didn't openly claim this property. You used my grandmother's death and the chaos of the estate settlement to slip in quietly, using forged documents that showed you had purchased the property from her before her death. You bribed the county clerk, Thomas Morrison, who conveniently retired to Florida in 2004 with a mysteriously inflated bank account, to file your fraudulent documents and lose the real ones. You can't prove that, Isabella said, but her voice lacked conviction. Racheal pulled out another folder, this one thicker. Actually, I can. Morrison kept records, meticulous records. And when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer last year, he decided to clear his conscience. He contacted me through my former court clerk and provided a full confession, along with copies of every document, every payment, every communication between him and your late husband. She paused, letting that sink in. He died 3 months ago, but not before giving a video deposition that is admissible in court. Isabella's legs seemed to give out. She reached for a nearby chair and sank into it, her elegant gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. Richard, she whispered. Richard told me he'd bought it legally. He said it was a foreclosure, that the previous owner had died and the estate needed quick cash. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Perhaps, Racheal said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe it. But ignorance isn't a defense, Mrs. Harrington. Not in the eyes of the law. Jesse moved to his mother's side, placing a hand on her shoulder. He looked at Racheal, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Judge Westbrook, I never thanked you properly for what you did for me. You changed my life. I went to college, got my degree, started a business. I've tried to be a good person, to honor the second chance you gave me. Racheal's expression softened slightly. I know, Jesse. I've kept track. You've done well. You've become the man I believed you could be. Then why? His voice broke. Why do this now? Why ruin my sister's wedding? Why humiliate my mother? If you wanted the property back, you could have just what? Racheal's voice hardened. Asked nicely? Negotiated? Jesse, I tried that. 5 years ago, I sent a letter to your mother, explaining the situation, offering to discuss a resolution. Do you know what she did? Jessie looked at Isabella, who had her face in her hands. Mother? She had her lawyers send me a cease and desist letter, Racheal continued, threatening me with harassment charges if I ever contacted her again, claiming I was trying to extort her. She pulled out yet another document. Here it is, signed by Martin Beckwith of Beckwith, Stone, and Associates. The letter explicitly denies any wrongdoing and asserts absolute ownership of this property based on legitimate purchase and 20 years of undisputed possession. Shaw was reading through the documents Racheal had provided, his expression growing darker with each page. Mrs. Harrington, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station for questioning. Wait, Jessie said, his voice desperate. Detective, Judge Westbrook, please. My sister's wedding, these guests. Can't we handle this privately? Tomorrow? Next week? This isn't the time or place for... Actually, Mr. Harrington, Racheal said, this is exactly the time and place. Because this wedding, this ostentatious display of wealth and privilege, is being held on my property without my permission. Every dollar your family has spent on this event, every moment of joy your sister is experiencing, is built on a foundation of fraud and theft. The bride, who had been standing frozen throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke. Her voice was small, shaking. Daddy bought this house illegally. Emily, no, sweetheart. Isabella started, but Emily wasn't looking at her mother. She was staring at Racheal, her mascara running down her cheeks. I'm getting married in a stolen house, Emily said, her voice rising with hysteria. My wedding, my perfect wedding, is happening in a place we don't even own. Everyone's going to know. Everyone's going to talk about this. We're going to be the family that committed fraud. Racheal finished gently. Yes, you are. Emily's new husband, a young man in an expensive tuxedo who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, put his arm around her. It's okay, Em. We'll figure this out. How? Emily shrieked. How are we going to figure this out? Our home isn't our home. Everything is a lie. A woman who appeared to be Emily's grandmother pushed through the crowd, her face twisted with rage. You should be ashamed of yourself, she spat at Racheal. Coming here, ruining this girl's special day. What kind of person does that? Racheal met her gaze steadily. The kind of person who has watched their family legacy be stolen and lived with that theft for 20 years. The kind of person who tried to resolve this quietly and was threatened with legal action. The kind of person who still believes in justice, Mrs. Harrington. I'm Mrs. Donaldson, the woman snapped. Isabella's mother. And I can tell you right now that my son-in-law purchased this property legitimately. He would never. Your son-in-law bribed a county official and forged documents. Shaw interrupted. Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but the evidence is pretty clear here. Racheal watched the family unravel, watched the facade of respectability crack and crumble. She felt no joy in it, but no guilt either. This was justice. Slow, measured, inevitable justice. An older gentleman in a perfectly tailored suit stepped forward. He had the look of someone used to being obeyed. I'm Howard Blackwell, Mrs. Harrington's attorney. Ms. Westbrook. If what you're saying is true, then I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. A financial settlement, perhaps. I'm authorized to offer. I don't want your money, Racheal said flatly. I want my property. Be reasonable, Blackwell said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. Mrs. Harrington and her family have lived here for 2 decades. They've made improvements worth millions of dollars. Surely you can't expect them to simply leave? Racheal smiled without humor. Actually, Mr. Blackwell, That's exactly what I expect, though I'm willing to give them more consideration than they gave my grandmother. Isabella looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? Racheal walked slowly toward her, her footsteps echoing in the now silent ballroom. 300 guests held their collective breath. I mean that, unlike your late husband, I'm not a thief. I'm a judge. And judges understand that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoration. She stopped directly in front of Isabella. Here's what's going to happen. You and your family have 60 days to vacate this property. During that time, you will cooperate fully with an independent appraisal of any legitimate improvements you've made. If those improvements added genuine value to the property, I will reimburse you for them, at cost, not at the inflated numbers I'm sure you're thinking of. That's not fair, Mrs. Donaldson shouted. They've lived here for 20 years. They've raised their children here. They've lived in a stolen house for 20 years, Racheal corrected. They've raised their children on property that didn't belong to them. And yes, Mrs. Donaldson, that matters. Because while they've been living in luxury on my land, I've been living in a 2-bedroom apartment, watching my grandmother's legacy be occupied by people who had no right to it. Jesse spoke up again, his voice steadier now. Judge Westbrook, what if we could arrange to purchase the property from you? At fair market value? We could get a loan, or the fair market value of this property is approximately $42 million, Racheal said. Can you secure that kind of financing? The silence that followed answered her question. I didn't think so, Racheal continued. But I'll tell you what I will do. Because your mother claims she didn't know about the fraud. And because you, Jesse, have genuinely tried to live a good life after I gave you that second chance, I'm offering you a choice. Isabella looked up, her makeup smeared, her carefully styled hair coming loose. What choice? You can leave in 60 days with whatever legitimate reimbursement you're owed, or... Racheal paused. You can stay. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Shaw raised his eyebrows. Even Isabella looked confused. Stay? Isabella whispered. As my tenants, Racheal clarified. I'm willing to lease this property to you at fair market rental rates. You'll sign a legally binding lease, you'll pay rent every month, and you'll acknowledge in writing that this property belongs to me and has always belonged to me. You'll also make a public statement accepting responsibility for what your husband did and apologizing for your role in perpetuating the fraud. You want us to humiliate ourselves, Isabella said bitterly. I want you to tell the truth, Racheal corrected. There's a difference. Emily's new husband spoke up for the first time since his wife's breakdown. And if they do all that, you'll let them stay? They won't lose their home? Racheal turned to him. They'll keep the house they've been living in, yes. But it will never be their home. It's my home. It was my grandmother's home. They'll just be living in it. For as long as they pay rent and honor the terms of the lease. Isabella seemed to be processing this, her expression shifting through a dozen emotions. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. What if I refuse? What if I make you evict us? Then I will, Racheal said simply. And I'll sue you for 20 years of back rent and damages. I'll tie up whatever assets you have left in litigation for the next decade. I'll make sure everyone in your social circle knows exactly how your family acquired this property. Your reputation, such as it is, will be destroyed. Your children will carry that stain for the rest of their lives. She leaned closer. Or you can choose dignity. You can accept responsibility, make amends, and move forward. Jesse put his hand on his mother's shoulder. Mom, I think we should take the deal. Jesse, no, Isabella said. She's trying to humiliate us. She's offering us mercy. Jesse interrupted. Don't you see that? After everything Dad did, after everything you've done by denying it, she's still giving us a way to stay. She doesn't have to do that. She could have us arrested right now for fraud. She could take everything. He's right, Shaw added. Mrs. Harrington, from a legal standpoint, you're in a very precarious position. If Miss Westbrook presses charges, and she has every right to, you could be facing serious prison time. Isabella's mother started to object, but Isabella held up a hand. She stood slowly, smoothing down her gown, with shaking hands. For a long moment, she just stared at Racheal, and Racheal stared back, unflinching. Finally, Isabella spoke. You really were a judge. I really was, Racheal confirmed. And you really did give Jesse a second chance. I did. So this is you giving me a second chance. It wasn't quite a question. Racheal considered this. No, this is me giving your children a second chance. You, Mrs. Harrington, I'm simply choosing not to destroy. There's a difference. Isabella absorbed this with a slight nod. Then, to everyone's surprise, she extended her hand. I accept your terms. We'll sign whatever lease you require. We'll make whatever public statement you want. We'll pay the rent. Racheal looked at the offered hand for a moment before taking it. The handshake was brief, formal, devoid of warmth. But it was an agreement. Detective Shaw will witness our arrangement, Racheal said, releasing Isabella's hand. And Mr. Blackwell, I assume you'll want to review the lease terms before your client signs anything. Of course, Blackwell said, though he looked somewhat dazed by the turn of events. Emily, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, stepped forward. What about my wedding? What about today? Racheal looked at the young bride, seeing the desperation in her face. Despite everything, Racheal felt a flicker of sympathy. This girl hadn't committed fraud. She'd just been born into a family that had. Your wedding can continue, Racheal said quietly. Consider it a wedding gift. One day on my property, free of charge. Emily burst into tears, of relief this time, and her new husband hugged her tightly. The grandmother started to say something, but Isabella shook her head sharply, silencing her. The classical quartet, which had stopped playing during the confrontation, tentatively started up again. Slowly, awkwardly, the wedding guests began to disperse, breaking into small groups, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of scandal that would fuel New York social circles for months. Racheal began packing up her documents, placing each one carefully back into her briefcase. Shaw approached her, a slight smile on his face. That was quite a performance, he said quietly. It wasn't a performance, Racheal replied. It was justice. Why now? Shaw asked. Why wait 20 years? Racheal snapped her briefcase closed. Because I needed to be absolutely certain. I needed evidence that would be irrefutable. I needed to be beyond my position as a federal judge so that no one could accuse me of using my authority improperly. She paused. And I needed to be sure that I was doing this for the right reasons, not out of revenge, but out of a genuine desire for what was right. And are you sure? Shaw asked. About your reasons? Racheal thought about this, watching Isabella being comforted by her son while her daughter danced her first dance with her new husband. I'm sure enough, she said finally. As Racheal walked toward the exit, Jesse hurried after her. Judge Westbrook, wait. She turned, and he stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped together. I just wanted to say, Thank you. Not just for today, but for 20 years ago. You saw something in me that nobody else did. You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. And I've tried every day since then to be worthy of that chance. Racheal's expression softened. You're welcome, Jesse. And for what it's worth, I think you've succeeded. You're not your father. Remember that. What about my mother? He asked quietly. Do you really think she didn't know? Racheal considered the question carefully. I think your mother knew something was wrong. I think she chose not to look too closely because it was easier to believe the comfortable lie than face the uncomfortable truth. That's not quite innocence, Jesse. But it's not quite guilt either. It's just human weakness. Jesse nodded slowly. Will you really let us stay? Or is this just another way of punishing us? I don't make offers I don't intend to honor, Racheal said. If your family abides by the terms of the lease, you can stay as long as you wish. But Jesse, understand something. This property will never be yours. When I die, it will go to my niece, my grandmother's great-granddaughter. Your family's presence here is conditional, temporary, dependent on my family's continued mercy. Make peace with that or leave now. I understand, Jesse said. He hesitated, then added, My father made a terrible mistake. He hurt you and your family. I can't undo that. But I can try to do better. We all can. Then do, Racheal said simply. She turned to leave again, but Jesse called after her once more. Judge Westbrook, when you come back to inspect the property, to finalize the lease, whatever, would you let me show you what we've done with the gardens? Your grandmother's rose garden, specifically. We've maintained it, improved it even. I think she would have been proud of it. For the first time since entering the ballroom, Racheal felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. I'd like that, Jesse. I'd like that very much. She walked out of the estate, Shaw accompanying her. As they reached the circular driveway where her modest sedan was parked among a sea of luxury vehicles, Shaw spoke again. You know they're never going to truly accept that this is your property. Isabella and her family, people like that don't really believe in consequences. They'll fight you, resist you, make your life difficult. Probably, Racheal agreed, unlocking her car. But that's fine. I've been a federal judge, detective. I've faced down drug cartels, corrupt politicians, and criminal enterprises worth billions of dollars. I think I can handle one entitled family in Saratoga Springs. Shaw laughed. I don't doubt it. He paused, then added, For what it's worth, I think you handled this perfectly. You could have crushed them. Instead, you gave them a path forward. That takes strength. Or stupidity, Racheal said with a slight smile. Time will tell which. She got into her car, placing her briefcase carefully on the passenger seat. Through the windshield, she could see the estate, her estate, illuminated by the setting sun. It was beautiful, just as she remembered from the summers she'd spent there as a child, before her grandmother's death, before the theft, before everything fell apart. Soon, she would walk through those halls again. She would sleep in the bedroom she'd occupied as a girl. She would tend her grandmother's roses. She would reclaim what had been stolen, not through violence or revenge, but through the steady application of law and justice. As she drove away, the sounds of the wedding, music and laughter and the clinking of crystal faded behind her. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of legally taking possession of the property. She would review the lease terms with her own attorney. She would ensure that every detail was documented, every I dotted, every T crossed. But tonight, she would go back to her two-bedroom apartment and sleep the sleep of someone who had finally, after 20 long years, set things right. Justice, she thought as she merged onto the highway, wasn't always swift. Sometimes it took decades. Sometimes it required patience, planning, and the wisdom to know when mercy was stronger than vengeance. But it always came. The sun set fully as Racheal drove home, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, like a promise that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. If this story taught us anything, it's that documentation is everything. Racheal won because she had irrefutable proof. So here's your reminder. Keep records, know your rights, and never underestimate the power of patience and preparation. Want more stories that'll inspire you to stand up for yourself and fight for what's yours? Subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what big lesson you took away from Racheal's story. Let's learn from each other.